Welcome to the latest episode of Surgeons' Lives. I'm your host, John Monson. My guest today is Professor Neil Smart, who is a consultant colorectal surgeon at the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital in the UK. His clinical interests include rectal cancer, hernia prophylaxis, and complex incisional hernia repair, as well as abdominal wall reconstruction. He is one of the foremost clinical academics in the UK, sitting on a number of study panels and an advisor to the NIHR. Since 2019, he's been the editor-in-chief of colorectal disease. For those of you listening rather than watching, I should tell you that Neil appears in this episode with a nasoenteral feeding tube in place because he is in the middle of treatment for esophageal cancer, which was diagnosed only a few months ago. Indeed, he wanted to come on this podcast today to speak about his journey as a patient and the challenges he has faced. So I think you'll find this a fascinating and actually quite inspirational interview. Please like and subscribe to the channel and send us whatever comments you may have. So without further ado, let's go over and talk to Professor Neil Smart. I'm John Monson, and this is Surgeons' Lives. Well, it's good to see you, and thanks for taking time out of your Friday afternoon. You will be, of course, unique amongst the podcast guests in that you're the only one with a feeding tube.
Yep.
But we'll come back to that later, shall we?
Yeah, and I think that it's actually probably it's a really good talking point because you have the title Surgeons' Lives, but this also touches on potentially surgeons' deaths. And I think that's a fair game for the topic as well, because curveballs happen and we should talk about it.
Yeah, and that's why I when I invited you recently, I chose the words carefully when I asked if you were ready to talk on the podcast because I'm not walking in your shoes, and for some people in your situation, it's a good thing, and for some people more challenging, but I wanted it to be your choice.
I think I've been fairly open amongst the
Yes.
surgical community, and I think it's probably good that we should have those discussions up front because I know, and I'm not alone in this. There are plenty of other people who've walked a mile in these moccasins before, but have always been slightly reticent to talk about it. And
Sure.
I'm taking a slightly opposite view that I think we probably should talk about it because, well, shit happens, doesn't it? So,
It does indeed. As I have a patient who has that tattooed on his leg, actually. Uh, yeah, that was when I had to take his pouch out. Anyway, let's start before we get into that. As we always start on this podcast by a little bit of early life, starting with the words I was born in.
so thank you very much for having me, first of all. I was born in Sherwood, in the outskirts of Nottingham, what was originally Sherwood Forest, but is now largely a suburb. It was where the maternity hospital was back in the 1970s. And my father was a coal miner and then worked in a factory. And my mother was a secretary, mainly in a hospital.
And so, where was the medical drive from?
So when you're young and impressionable, you get all sorts of fancy ideas about what you might want to do with your life and what you might want to be. And I was heavily influenced by a BBC documentary called 14 Days in May, which featured a British lawyer who was doing pro bono human rights law in the United States and against death penalty cases. And so I decided very early on that I was going to be a human rights barrister.
Okay.
And I went to see my careers teacher at school, And he went, okay, that's cool. Young, clever, ambitious lad. You want to be a barrister? No problem. What are you going to study at university? And I looked at him gone out and went, well, law, obviously. And he looked at me back and went, no, 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 you don't have to study law at university to be a barrister. And I went, all right. Well, why wouldn't you? And he went, because law's really boring. And I went, oh, so what's the most fun that you can do at university? And he went, medicine's an absolute hoot, and you'd be great at it. And I went, oh, it never occurred to me until that point. So they arranged for me to go off and do some work experience. And I went to the local hospital in Nottingham, and there were some phenomenal people there at the time, particularly in breast cancer surgery. So people like Roger Blamey, who you probably remember, Chris Elston's the pathologist, all that Nottingham Prognostic Index stuff.
Yeah.
I ended up doing work experience as a 16-year-old with that team. Oh, blew my mind. And next thing you know, changed course completely. I want to be a doctor.
It's interesting, and I think I've told this story before, but a lot of people who remember Roger Blamey, of course, remember him for the breast cancer and the PNI, as you say. But a lot of people don't remember that Roger was a transplant surgeon, and essentially woke up one day and said, "Yeah, I'm not doing this transplant stuff anymore." And he probably invented Trump's technique before Trump did, in that he decided one day that whatever the question was, whatever the topic he was asked about, his answer would be breast cancer. Breast cancer. And he just kept saying breast cancer. And then, fast forward, he's, a globally famous contributing academic breast surgeon. Extraordinary story just to pivot like that,
Yeah,
but with determination.
yeah. And it was quite interesting to see how they took with open arms a 16-year-old kid and were happy to discuss, life as a surgeon, as a pathologist, and I got to see a whole variety of things. And I was extraordinarily grateful for it giving me insight. And it's certainly influenced me down the line in terms of, do I accept work experience students? Absolutely, because I know what it did for me. It changed my whole career, whole life, and it gave me insight into something that's given me a great deal of joy and pleasure over the years.
So a lot of people tell me that when they go into medical school, that they are going to be whichever specialty they're doing their attachment with at that time. I'm going to be a surgeon, and then they go and do pediatrics. Oh my God, I'm going to do pediatrics, etc. How long did it take you to decide you were going to do surgery? I mean, your opening exposure was to surgery, but how long did it take you for you to decide?
Quite a while. You've had some notable guests on here who've talked about mentorship, and particularly through medical school, both good and bad experiences. I was extremely fortunate that I had some amazing positive experiences of mentorship. I ended up going to medical school in Newcastle upon Tyne. And the reason I went there was because it was one of only two medical schools in the UK at the time that offered a combined MBBS PhD program. And I knew it was quite bright and academically orientated, and thought it'd be a good idea to do my PhD young. So I did. And I did it with two people, a guy called Simon Miller, who was the professor of anatomy, and his wife, Janet Eyre, who was the professor of pediatric neurology. And I think Janet in particular was probably my first real mentor of what I want to be, that brilliant clinical academic who could slip from translational to coalface clinical work seamlessly. And it was a really good model of how to do high quality research as an academic, but also a clinician well early in my career. And I think when I came out of it, I wanted to be a pediatric neurologist.
Yeah.
And then I did one of those student selected topics in that you get to do, and I did it in pediatric neurology. And the challenge I had was that whilst there were some bits that were fascinating, there were other bits that I couldn't cope with emotionally, particularly things like the child abuse, shaken baby syndromes. And I decided that realistically, that probably wasn't for me. So I thought, well, where else am I going to use my um, PhD in? And I thought, well, what about neurosurgery? And I went and did an elective with the professor of neurosurgery in Newcastle, a guy called David Mendeley, and he was phenomenal. And ultimately, he's probably the blueprint for what I've turned into. Some would be a clinical academic doing trials, doing a small, select, niche number of operations, but doing them really well, but not doing everything broadly. And he was the guy who showed me that you could be a brilliant academic and a great surgeon, and thought that's what I want to be. Neurosurgery wasn't necessarily it,
Yeah.
but it was certainly a really good starting point, and he was phenomenal. And then in my final year rotation, I worked on Mike Griffin's unit in the RVI and upper GI surgery. And that really got me into general surgery. And, Mike was inspirational for all sorts of reasons during my career. And that's what I decided I was probably going to go down. And then as a houseman, I ended up in Gateshead working for two colorectal surgeons called Bill Cunliffe and Mark Mercer Jones. And that was it. I had a whale of a time, and I thought, this is what I want to do. And Mark was particularly helpful in making me see sense and going to the colorectal side. The rest, as they say, is history.
Some still waters with Bill Cunliffe, you know.
He's a phenomenal man, and it's quite interesting when I look back now. He'd come back to the UK having worked for Stan Goldberg in Minnesota, and I often remember him saying, "Well, we used to do this with Stan." And funny, I met Stan years later, and it was fantastic to see how little far the acorn had fallen from the oak tree. That's the best way to put it. And there's this great lineage. And Mark had trained as well in the US, in Louisville with Hiram Park and Susan Galandia. And it's really fascinating because I think, when I did start traveling as an academic, I was particularly keen to go to the US, probably because of the positive experiences that Bill and Mark had talked about so early in my career. So it's why you see me so often at conferences in the US when I can travel.
So did you describe what you describe as role models and very strong role models? Nowadays, we discuss mentorship and sponsorship and one thing or another. Were you conscious that they were, and were they conscious that this was more than just a role model and there was a mentorship element to it, or was there a mentorship element to it?
Yeah, there definitely was. I mean, there are people who worked for, particularly when I became a registrar, where that became much more clear cut. I had the great privilege early in my career to work for Mark Coleman in Plymouth, and he was just fabulous. And then from a hernia perspective, I'd worked a little bit with Hugh Gallagher up in the northeast for some of the abdo wall stuff, and then for Andrew Kingsnorth in Plymouth. And it's one of those things, isn't it? Sometimes you just make your own luck. Sometimes you're lucky. Not certain which way it falls out, but there were lots of people there who were willing to mentor if you were willing to be menteed. And I had some great people who were helpful later in my colorectal career when I was trying to figure out more niche market stuff. Where exactly am I going to go? I worked with Ian Daniels in Exeter, who then became, I became his colleague. I worked with Nada Francis in Yeovil, and then guys in Bristol as well with Mike Thomas, and then going over to Colchester to work with Tanner Alampalam and Roger Motson was just superb. It was like a real finishing school in terms of those ACP GBI fellowships that existed in lap colorectal surgery at the time. It was, I came through at that golden age with all the LAPCO stuff that I know that you were involved in early doors, and Mark took over and really made it a fantastic place to be in the UK at the time. It was just great.
And I think it was a time when the places that you could be to pursue clinical academic pathway was expanding. In my day, John McPhee
Yeah,
went to Scarborough, and John was a powerful clinical academic, and the general outsider consensus was, well, that's a dead end. He should be in the big house somewhere, wherever, and there were limited numbers of big houses, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Bristol, etc. The main university places. And then there was a generational change with all of the places that you mentioned, Colchester and Portsmouth and Exeter and et cetera, where now people were legitimately pursuing academic initiatives, etc., that didn't happen before in those locations, and it's a hugely positive development.
it is. And I think one of the things that happened in the UK around the end of the 2010s was I think there was a sea change, a big shift in attitude about collaboration as opposed to competition that had been
Yeah.
so common in the past, and people were much more willing to work together. And I think it's fair to say that, Dion Morton and Tom Pinkney should really take a lot of the credit for that. They
Yeah.
weren't alone in it, but it certainly opened change in environment. And it's been good to see that it's flourished. And now we look around the globe and there are a lot of people who are trying to replicate the models that have come out of the UK and think that's a real feather in their cap and they should be recognised for it. I certainly benefited from it when I transitioned from being a fellow into a consultant, because when I was looking around for how am I going to do academia somewhere where perhaps traditionally there hasn't been academia at the level that we're now looking at, there's this fertile landscape of dedicated surgical trials hubs. NIHR was coming out with funding and were interested in funding surgery. And I got a huge amount of help from the team in Bristol and Jane Blaisby in particular. And it was that hub and spoke model worked really well, and say, I don't know whether it's because I'm a lucky guy or whether I've made my own luck, but I seem to have been in the right place at the right time. And when opportunities have come along, I've been fortunate enough to take advantage of them. And it has been a real joy. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've had phenomenal experience. It's all been positive. I haven't had much in the way of downside. And I know that there are some people who don't share my experiences, but I can only speak as I find.
Well, I think you use the words there, the difference between competition and collaboration. There's certainly, in the 80s, it was, when I was a registrar and, then early faculty, there was, collaboration was not the word, competition was the word. And there was a phase where, you know, that was how you were brought up to be. You were going to dominate in your own world or whatever. And I think, a few people, I don't know whether it was people or what, but I think that change to collaboration was hugely positive. And, now collaboratives, are much more successful. I mean, they have their own downsides. It's not the purest of science in some respects, but I think it's a lot better, as you point out. Now, you chose, or they chose, you chose and they chose Exeter for you. What was the draw apart from the lovely Mr. Daniels?
It was strange. I mean, I'd worked there as a registrar. I loved it a lot. It was great. There were some challenges in my personal life at the time. in terms of family, where my family and my wife's family were located in the UK. So I did look around at other jobs and applied for jobs far and wide and got rejected from lots of institutions. It's always quite sobering when you're applying for consultant jobs, and certainly wasn't dead man's shoes at my time in the way it was probably for your generation. Um, so I don't think I can complain too much, but it's a fairly sobering experience going for a consultant interview and being told we've not chosen you when you think, I thought I had a really good CV. I thought it was going to be meritocratic. And of course, whilst it is, it's also not. It's about the can you work with someone? Have you worked with them before? Do they like you? And it's nothing personal when they don't choose you. It's just that they don't always have the money for all the people they'd like to appoint. But it was certainly a sobering experience and didn't quite know how to take it all at the time. And look back at it and think, well, it probably made me stronger because it didn't kill me. Um, but Ian was always very forthright in his view that he wanted me as a colleague, and he knew that with the right place, the right environment, and the right support, that I would go on to do things and achieve. Well, he was right, wasn't he? So I'd like to think he was right.
Yeah, he wanted you to make him famous,
Yeah.
We'll put it that way, shall we?
I mean, it was interesting. There were certainly a few friends who pointed out to me who were consultants elsewhere and said, challenge when you turn up in a situation when you're at your stage and you've got the CV and you've got whistles and bells on it and you've done certain things. You can be quite intimidating to some people, and you'll put a lot of people off because they won't want the competition. They won't necessarily want someone threatening the private practice. I had no interest in that anyway. I was more interested in the academia, and it was, I suppose, it was an interesting decision because you've got to have a fairly strong sense of self to take someone on and go, well, you're going to be the person who's going to push us forward. Some year or two later, I'd ended up recounting similar stories to Ronan O'Connell when I was at ESCP one year. We were having dinner, and Ronan, I had just been appointed vice president of the college in Ireland around that time, and leant over and said to me something that I've never forgotten, and it was a brilliant piece of wisdom. He said, Neil, the secret of building a big unit and a great unit is finding people who are better than you and appointing them.
Sure.
So,
Yeah. Uh,
wisdom.
yeah.
And
It's what I have always referred to as the ability to bask in reflected glory, and that is not a skill that is or a characteristic that's shared by everyone.
yeah,
And I'm sure you could produce a list of half a dozen people off the top of your head who are extremely bad at basking in reflected glory. And
there are many.
yeah, exactly.
And we won't name names, not here. It's not but,
As they
it
say,
certainly
you
is.
know who you are.
Yeah, I certainly think, that piece of advice that Ronan gave me was utterly invaluable. And, there've been plenty of people over the years who I've sought out, and they've all kind of given the same piece of advice. And, other people have been incredibly generous with their time when it's come to helping me develop my career going forward. So,
As
I've been very lucky.
I've had that conversation uh, with people over the years about, recruiting the best people you can get. Murray Brennan said to me many years ago, he said, never appoint a B team player to the A team because two things will happen. He says, firstly, they will never become A team and they will never leave. So he said, you will regret it. And, when talking about, appointing people who are better than you are, I've had that conversation with people, and I had a colleague in Hull who said to me, well, that should be quite easy for you then, really. Said, yes,
I mean,
thanks very
I've
much.
taken the view that, you know, things can happen to us in life, as we'll get on to talking about. And you shouldn't appoint someone to your unit who you wouldn't be happy to have operate on you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think that's a really good starting point. And I think it's very wise. And I've been lucky to have some fantastic colleagues. I think the best second piece of advice I got was when I went to visit Royal Prince Alfred in Sydney and had asked Michael Solomon, how had he built a unit so successfully and what was he looking for in particular individual surgeons? And his comment to me was, well, it's dead simple. No assholes. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a really good point. You've got to choose people who, you can work with, teamwork, that type of stuff that plays. And it comes back to that whole collaboration, not competition. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
as anybody who's spoken to me on the subject knows, I have a stock of Bob Sutton's book, the No Asshole Rule book.
yeah,
And
got it too.
I think they're about $10 on Amazon, but I literally have
Yeah,
a box of them and I give them to all of my, fellows and colleagues, etc. It's one transatlantic flight, you've read the book, and
yeah.
it should be something that you never forget. It doesn't make everyone, lovely people, but it provides some insight. Now, you said that earlier that you developed a niche in terms of clinical practice, the colorectal side and then the abdominal wall side. Increasingly over the decades, the NHS, has struggled with delivering volume, of course, rather than niche. And I've always advised young people starting who say, well, I'd like to develop, special expertise in the splenic fracture, and that'll be my career, etc. So what I'll do is I'll get established for 4 or 5 years, and then I'll start to do that. And I always say to them, no, you got to do it on day one, and you've got to start telling people that's what you're doing. You got to do what Roger Blamey did, make
Mm.
the decision and drive through it with determination. Did you find it easy, or how did you find it to develop that niche?
So first and foremost, I think I knew that I wanted to do rectal cancer specifically, and that was easy because I was in a setup where I was pair-blooded with Ian, and that made life very straightforward. That meant that I created lots of stomas, and the thing with creating lots of stomas is you end up creating lots of parastomal hernias.
Sure.
And in the NHS problem or setup, you've got to fix your own problems. So if I'm creating the parastomal hernias, I'm fixing them. I'm also, therefore, minded to try and prevent the problem from happening in the first instance. And similarly with the other hernias that come from rectal cancer treatment, like
Yeah.
incisional and perineal hernias. And that's how it all kind of came together. And very quickly, because everyone hated parastomal hernias because they were difficult to deal with, they were difficult to fix, nothing was working. Everyone was very happy to have them over, as I discovered. And it was very quickly apparent that there was this whole group of patients who were out there who were just neglected because no one knew what to do with them. And that had two things, which I think in my career, one, it turbocharged the incentive to try and find out how not to end up with a problem in the first instance. And secondly, it turbocharged the um, incentive to find a way to deal with it. And that's been really where a lot of my academic focus has then gone because it was an open door. And, about 18 months into my colorectal career, there's this commissioned NIHR call that comes out going, oh, we want to look at a study about how to stop patients getting parastomal hernias. And I put in a grant application and I was fortunate to get it. And, within 2 years, I've been appointed a consultant with help from Jane Blaisby in particular. Suddenly I'm walking around with this 7-figure NIHR grant and thinking, okay, I've got to deliver this. And it's been my life's work. And it's been huge privilege to end up in a position where I've ended up trying to solve perhaps one of the most difficult, thorny problems in colorectal surgery. And because stomas are the final common pathway for every colorectal surgeon, it doesn't matter whether you're IBD, cancer, pelvic floor, functional, whatever, our fallback situation is stoma. And I think in the past, things weren't done perhaps quite as well as they might have been with, the surgeon sort of looking at the registrar, going, okay, you close the abdomen and make the stoma. And things were perhaps not done as well as they might have been. And we know that, there were consequences for patients down the line. And I think that's changing quite rapidly now.
I had a conversation, a conference call on a different matter recently with a surgeon who was a little late to the call, and he said, "Sorry, I was just in the OR. I was just fixing a hernia." And I said, "Oh yeah, well, what you do?" And he said, "I was an ileostomy hernia." I said, "So what did you do?" He said, "Well, I moved the ileostomy over to the other side and put some stitches in the hernia." I went, "Okay, that's
That won't work. Wait
well,
till the parastoma hernia occurs around the new stoma. Yeah,
well."
we know what's coming.
This way, yes. Now the patient has bilateral hernias. So, anyway,
Exactly.
so uh, there you are in Exeter, and the next thing that comes up is colorectal disease, and you've been in that post for a number of years now. What I wanted to ask you is uh, a lowly co-editor of DCR. But nonetheless involved in what's going on with journals these days. I mean, it's impact factor seems not to matter anymore, and the internet is disrupting stuff, and AI is writing the papers for people. What would you say to your um, if you were asked to train up a new editor of DCR or colorectal disease, what's the future?
Great question. I mean, I got involved in colorectal disease in 2011 when there was a call for a junior editor, and I went for interview, and it was John Bynon and John Nichols, and they decided to appoint me. And I was fortunate to be mentored for John Nichols for many years, and it was a masterclass at that stage of where journals were at. And things did start to change, and we could
Yeah,
see that when Neil Mortensen came along as editor-in-chief, we could start to see that shift towards everything going online, and more recently the shift to open access. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the journals in surgery over the past few years have all started to flip to open access. And all of the Springer Nature surgical suite seem to are flipping, with great alacrity. I had an email through today to say that Langenbeck's archives is going away, techniques have gone away, IJCD have gone away. And I think that is, certainly the future. But the problem we've got, and as you hit the nail on the head, is I suppose it's about the honesty and veracity of the submissions that we are getting. We've got two major problems. Number one, the paper mills, and they are very difficult to detect now. Whereas 5 years ago, you could reliably assume that submissions from certain countries were likely to be paper mill orientated. And that's difficult to say, but we know that there were challenges with China, Iran, Russia. I think it's much more difficult to detect now, and particularly as societies of surgical learned societies have become much more international. People have started to come into the fold. They've tried to take part in collaborative studies like we've already talked about. People are trying to do honest work. So it becomes much more difficult to tease apart that which is, quite frankly, malicious and just fabricated. It's quite difficult. And the second thing is the role of AI. And AI is challenging because it can't actually take responsibility for the content as an author. And we know there are issues with things like GPT, even version 4.0, where they still have these issues with daydreaming where it just makes stuff up. We
Yeah.
can't reliably use those types of AI chatbots for things like peer review because we don't know whether you're going to get daydreaming as that process. And of course, it means that you're taking something that should be confidential and putting it through something in the public domain so it takes part in the learning process. You can't do that at the moment. There's some proprietary things behind paywalls within different publishers which can do certain aspects of it, but it's not straightforward. It's a difficult time. We're seeing really disruptive things happening. I mean, some of the news that came out in Nature and Science earlier this week with one of the major open access publishers, eLife, and other generic journals, has had its impact factor stripped, partly because of some of its decisions, particularly trying to publish everything open and say, well, actually, we're not going to do peer review anymore. We're going to do post-publication peer review, and here's the
Yeah.
manuscript, here's the public peer review stuff that we've had done. It's turned into like a format of bioarchive or medRxiv. That's meant that they've lost their impact factor. And then who's going to pay £2,500 to submit to eLife when you don't then get indexed in any of the major
Yeah.
repositories? So it's a
Yeah.
difficult time. I mean, whichever way you want to argue how it should be done, should it all be open access, should there be money or not, or wherever, not straightforward because some of those decisions just don't fly with other people and they want as metrics.
It's interesting. There was a little bit of I think it was Twitter or something, a little bit of a debate about AI and should AI be allowed, to construct pieces of a paper, etc. And, what is original research and all that sort of, back in the day, there were a number of people, if they were lucky, they had, their big department had a medical writer that would take, their text and write it. I mean, on one level, that's all AI is. ChatGPT, I mean, is, instead of having some very pleasant failed novelist sitting in an office somewhere writing your paper about rectal cancer, you just press a button and it's done. It's going to take some time. And also, when I was a boy, you lived and died on impact factor. Nobody cares about that now in most universities. They're moving away from that, They want that seven-figure grant. They don't care about the impact factor.
I think they're also interested as more as the citations. So
Yeah, yeah,
whether it attracts citations and how it might influence. So things like altmetrics. Altmetrics is not perfect either. It's got its own issues. But some of the concept about the spheres of influence and how you've impacted society, have you altered how things are done? Has it impacted policy? Those types of things are all coming to the fore. And I think the smartest researchers are now looking at how they report their impact of their research. And so they'll say, well, look, the COVID
yeah,
Search Collaborative is a good example. It wasn't just that it was cited lots, it was in high impact factor journals. It was the fact that it was published in 10, or it was cited in 10 national guidelines
yeah.
for learned societies. It was done by five, governmental departments, cited their work for how you should structure surgical services. Those kind of things become much more meaningful.
It was a global
Perhaps,
pandemic with the word global on the title of the paper also, sort of.
yeah,
So
perhaps that's the way we should be evaluating research more. But I mean, it's only going to be a small proportion of what's produced. I mean, it's niche market stuff. And, we had a very unusual time with the pandemic. It was, once in a generation or once in a lifetime thing, perhaps.
yeah, I mean, of the 400 or so papers that I've published, the overwhelming majority will not trouble the historians, that's for sure, by a long way. So there you are, fixing hernias, preventing hernias, treating rectal cancer, sorting out journals, and then suddenly life changed for you. Uh,
Yeah,
Tell
does
us
that,
that
doesn't it?
story. Yeah, well, just
Yeah, a
when you
bit of a
weren't
curveball.
expecting it. Yeah.
So I was at a meeting in Turkey And I was at the dinner the night before, and I took some fish, and it got stuck, and it wouldn't swallow, wouldn't go down, and thought that's not normal. Um, and my colleagues from Turkey were looking at me going, "You're not right." No, no, I'm fine. I promise I'm fine. Standard English attitude. But it wasn't fine. And that's the first time that I'd noticed some dysphagia and some external food sticking. We got back to the UK and like lots of other things. Life's busy, straight into on call, having more problems swallowing. Had to go off to Sages, went to Sages, a further episode of food bolus obstruction at Sages. That scared me a little because I was a long way from home. And then I got back to the UK and I saw my gastroenterology colleague and I went, I'm not right. I think I might have esophageal cancer. He went, no, no, you're 50-ish. You're on 49. So I was a bit miffed at him calling me 50. Um, and and you're on a PPI, so you'll have eosinophilic esophagitis, just like all the other blokes that we see, and you're white as well. So you're in that demographic who's really high risk for it. I'll scope you next Friday. So I'm like, okay. So I went on the 2 week wait pathway, as you do in the UK. Just thought, well, I better get it done that way. So make sure all the boxes are ticked. And I said to him before I got the midazolam sedation, look, if it does turn out to be something, I'm really sorry that I've had to put it on you. But, we've worked together for 15 years. You trained me how to do scopes. Anyway, turns out I was right. And got down there, and it was a nasty looking esophagogastric malignancy, which was fairly frankly obvious. I'd had a CT scan later that day, which demonstrated no obvious metastatic disease, and went through the usual MDT process, which was decided to have neoadjuvant chemotherapy. Standard of care was FLOT. So 4 different types of chemo as a combination, which was interesting to go through, and all the side effects. And I knew the day I had my diagnosis who I wanted to do my operation and where I wanted it done. It was an absolute no-brainer for me. You think about how we are as surgeons, and there are certain things that you tend to value. And I tend to value, I want someone who knows what to talk about. I want someone who's got the technical skills.
Yeah.
And I want someone who's got the humanity. And perhaps the humanity element is probably the most important of all. You want someone who gets you, and you want someone who you can have absolute faith in when they're standing at the end of your bed when it's all gone horribly wrong, because it may do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's surgery when it happens. And, it's happened to me when I've been the surgeon and I've operated on staff members who are colleagues or family members of colleagues. It's an awful place to be, but I knew that I had to choose the right person for me. I knew who that person was, and I phoned him on the day I got my diagnosis. And I got exactly what I wanted to hear, which was, I've got you. It's all right. You'll be fine. And, I have to say that I've had an amazing experience on the NHS. I've been very fortunate in that I've had exemplary care. I ended up having my neoadjuvant chemotherapy. I worked hard at trying to do my prehabilitation
Yes, you
by the
did.
chemotherapy.
Yeah.
You saw all the photos on my Facebook page, and I managed to improve my anaerobic threshold and VO2
Yeah.
max.
And
And I
you
was doing
got
everything.
fairly rapidly streamlined as well, because
I did.
you know,
I did. I lost the hair, just that went out with the flot. And
yeah,
I lost about 10 kilograms in weight. And then I got restaged, didn't show anything different. And then I went up to Newcastle upon Tyne for my surgery, which was planned robotically. And well, things didn't quite go according to plan. So I got inside and it wasn't quite as advertised in all the staging.
yeah.
It's more advanced. It turned out that it was a T4 cancer. So they had to change the operative strategy, and I ended up having an extended total gastrectomy, so all my stomach's gone, lower half of my esophagus is gone, and took away my pleura, some of the pleura to get clearance, and they used a loop to sort everything out for me and restore gastrointestinal continuity. And day one, day two post-op was good. Walking 600 meters. It was a joy of robotic surgery.
Yeah.
Little trauma. I had no pain. I was flying. I was fabulous. And then day three, unfortunately, I had a small anastomotic leak. It was contained, but it was certainly enough to make me unwell.
Set you
And
back a bit. Yeah.
I was on the intensive care unit for a week, multi-organ failure. I
Good.
came through it and had, phenomenal care from an amazing team. Who are every bit deserving of the quality of reputation that they have, just superb. And I was doing okay. Um, and things were getting better, and I was starting to eat, and my leak had healed. And then we got the histology, and the histology was sadly unfortunate. It was a T4A N3 tumor with lots of nodes outside of the juxtatumoral position. Was EMVI positive, HER2 positive. So all the bad prognostic signs that you can possibly have, I've got
Yeah.
them all.
Yeah.
Sobering position to be in. And certainly if you look at the last set of national cancer data on esophageal gastric tumours that were released in the NHS, and you can download it all open access for us, there are no 5-year survivors. Median survival, something around 2 years if you're lucky. But that was without modern chemotherapy,
Yeah.
modern surgery, and modern adjuvant treatments.
Yeah.
So we had lots of discussions about what we might do with adjuvant treatment, and that's my oncologist, some searching questions, who said to me quite honestly, I don't know the answers to the questions that you're looking for. And in fact, they're very good questions. I'm not certain whether anyone knows the answers for what to do. I might get a second opinion. It's cool by me.
Yeah.
I don't know who to get the second opinion from, but I'll find out and I'll phone you. And he phoned me a couple of days later to say, I know who I'm going to send you to see. And are you happy with that? I went, sounds great. And within 10 minutes, I had a phone call from the oncologist in Oxford, who phoned me up and said, I've got a clinical trial that's open today with a new targeted chemotherapy agent. Are you interested? And the answer is, of course, well, yeah. So next thing I know, I was in Oxford having things like ctDNA blood test done and a few other things. And eventually yesterday, I got started on my new targeted chemotherapy. So I had that as my first infusion of 8. And, I've gone from poacher to gamekeeper, or whichever way around it is,
Yeah.
where I'm saying that, I shouldn't be asking my patients to do that which I'm not prepared to do myself. So during my treatment, if there have been clinical trials, I've taken part in them, did when I was in Newcastle for one of the ITU trials. Again, I'm doing it now for one of the oncology trials, because
Sure.
what leads to better care and what leads to better results and outcomes. So
Your challenge, who knows, what the long-term future holds for you or any of us. You could be found dead on the moor on one of your little jaunts, as you as you point out. Um, but you're living at the moment with challenges that most people don't have in their head. Um,
yeah, I mean, it
and
certainly
that must be
sobering
a
as
roller coaster for you.
yeah, certainly as a 49-year-old, where all of a sudden you find yourself with an immediately life-threatening condition is sobering. Not just for me, but for the family
Yeah.
and all those kind of things. It certainly stopped me dead in my tracks as an operative surgeon, because I was needing treatment that was going to leave me potently, profoundly immunosuppressed. So patients were therefore a risk to me. So I couldn't operate. I couldn't see patients face to face.
Mhm.
I could carry on with a little bit of academic work and some editorial work, but even that ground to halt because of the side effects of chemotherapy. And I've been very fortunate to have support from Sue Clark as a co-editor in chief. It's been phenomenal to work with over the past 6 months as all this kicked off. And it's made me stop and evaluate, well, where is the value going forward? I would love to get back to doing some sort of operative surgery and seeing patients. I think I've still got something to offer. I'm only 50. If I'm fortunate enough to live, I think I've got lots I can offer. Maybe not to the same volume and intensity that I maybe had before, but at least I've got something. And I've still got things academically I think I can contribute. I've still put grant applications in while I've been off and doing a few things and maybe see whether they come to fruition. More stuff from NIH. It would be great if it did. So there's lots for us to look forward to. And, I'm trying to do that which entertains me and gives me joy. And I
Yeah.
like some of that academic cut and thrust. It's great fun. I think I'm very privileged to have been able to do it. I think I've done it reasonably well. It's never perfect, for is.
Sure.
It's a difficult world in medical publishing at the moment, but I would like to think that I've tried to put patient at the heart of what we've done in medical publishing, made things much more patient focused. So I'd like to carry on that journey if possible.
How long are you into the diagnosis now from the Turkey day in Turkey?
So
Eh?
I got my diagnosis of cancer formally when I had my OGD on the 17th of May. So I'm over 6 months now. And I'm probably going to be off work for another 6 months at the very least while
Sure.
I have my
Yeah.
experimental chemo. So,
So, uh, if you were called by a colleague or anyone, a patient tomorrow to say, "Hey, listen, somebody just told me I got esophageal cancer. I know you're going through this. What would you what would your advice be? Not that you have the answer, because no one does, but what would you say?"
so first thing is, and I've dispensed this wisdom to a couple of people over the past 6 months, you can't look after others unless you look after yourself first. You have to be number one in this process. And you have to make sure that you take all the time that you need, not just for your own physical health. And I've had challenges that you've alluded to. I've lost about 25-30% of my body weight with cancer cachexia. I've got issues at the moment where I can't eat, hence I'm nasovaginal fed 100%. And that may come back, hopefully. But you can't look after other people when you're not in a position to look after yourself. You have to put yourself number one. And I think it was straightforward for me because the NHS, all of its many ills, and it has many, trust me, I know them, is actually quite a good employer. And its terms and conditions for sick leave are fantastic, and particularly with the NHS pension. So I'm very fortunate to have all of that to fall back on. And I was very well insured. So I haven't got that financial pressure to work. So time away, so I can deal with not just the physical challenges, but also the cognitive ones of a cancer diagnosis. That's been probably the most important thing. That's quite system specific to the NHS, but I would advise people anywhere, make sure you've got good income protection insurance, life insurance, all those things. Takes away the worry.
Yeah, for sure. It's always been my experience, or not always, but it's commonly been my experience over the years treating cancer patients that the patient, get their head around it, whatever they're facing, more quickly than their family, because they have no choice. It doesn't switch off in their head 24/7, whereas, their family and their friends can go to work tomorrow and they're not thinking about it every hour of the day. And that that sometimes leads to tension within families where the patient is saying, no, I'm going to go to the clinic tomorrow, get my chemo, I'm fine, thank you. And the family are going, what the hell's wrong with you? Where, etc. Does that resonate with you at all, or?
There are elements of that, and I think it has to be said. There have been challenges. My wife is not medically qualified, though she works in the NHS. And when I go to appointments, I like people to talk to me like I am their colleague because I am their colleague. And a particular challenge, I suppose, in being an academic is I can read all of their charts. I can read all of their papers. I can interpret them and understand them just as well as they can. I have read all the literature on my diagnosis. I've read all the trials of the chemotherapy that I'm getting. I know it as inside out as they do. Difference is I've never sailed on those seas.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the difference. That's where they have the expertise that I don't. That's what I come to them for. It's like, this is what the chart says. What's it like in reality, and how do you sail that? Because that's what I don't have. Um, and my clinicians have been brilliant at talking to me in the language that works for me. That's fabulous. It's really helpful. Downside is it leaves everyone else in the room cut out of that
Yeah.
conversation. And I appreciate that's difficult. And sometimes the challenge is, well, can I put it in lay language? Well, they can for my wife. The difficulty is if you put it in lay language to me, I'm going to go, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? So it doesn't work.
Yes. You probably are a potentially very annoying patient, actually, to have, you
Oh,
know.
deeply.
Yes.
I have insight.
Yes.
Surgeons are just annoying generally to
Yeah.
most people. I mean, I know that. But no, it's yeah, I can imagine that it can be quite difficult when you're faced with someone like me if the puts on the other foot. But I mean, genuinely, they have been phenomenal. I've
Yeah.
been very, very lucky.
And you say you know the papers just as well as they do. That's not true. You know the papers much better than they do, actually, because, well, that's obviously the case because, they I'm not saying that they just read the abstract, but they don't have the personal investment in this trial that you do. So clearly, and you'll have read it 6 times,
Yeah,
etc. And so, it's never easy, but and it's whatever works for you as the patient is the
yeah,
important thing.
yeah. And don't yeah, don't disagree. I think some of those papers I've read a lot and gone, how does this work for people like me? Have I been represented in this subgroup of patients that they've analysed? And the answer is often no. It's often people who are much older, much more frail, more comorbid, all those kind of things. And, young people like me are not common in the United Kingdom with this type of diagnosis, and certainly not at this stage.
No, for sure. Yeah. Well, we wish you well, of course, and hopefully you'll get rid of the fetching um, tube, etc., in due course. So let me, in the last couple of minutes, ask you some very important questions
Okay.
that I think everyone will want to know. What is your greatest extravagance?
Probably champagne,
Now that
which
I,
is awkward at the moment.
yeah, it is. Although it clears the tube quite nicely with the
Yeah.
effervescence.
Had a rather important, significant 50th birthday recently, and not being able to touch a drop, and certainly couldn't swallow anything was, yeah, that was a bit of a downer. But my greatest extravagance, yeah, probably champagne.
The key is that it should be vintage champagne.
Oh yeah, all the Grand Mark stuff, Krug, you name it, bit of Dom Perignon, yeah, all the
So
fancy pants stuff.
I think you may have told us this earlier, but if you were not a surgeon, what would you be? Would you be that lawyer
Uh,
or not?
Still think I'll probably be a human rights barrister.
Okay, all right. Um, who around the world, alive and kicking today, do you admire?
Um, not often that I would choose a politician, but Barack and Michelle Obama spring to mind. I think both I thought were absolute class acts.
What's your ideal Saturday?
Um, in the summer, well, spring, summer, and autumn months, it's usually either being out on my bike or being out on the moors walking.
Yes, I have visions of you out on that moor, and just I constantly wonder if the police are monitoring you at any point in time.
Um, I think in the winter it's different because the thing I can't be bothered because the weather's too terrible. But what I do instead is I go and watch my son play rugby, as they usually play rugby matches on my Saturday, and it's always actually quite good fun going to watch him. He's 14 now, and he's and this is quite you don't get this sense when I'm sitting down, but as someone who at the highest point in his career reached the lofty heights of 5'7", I seem to have bred a second row forward, and I don't quite understand that, and I don't know how that genetics works,
Yeah,
but he's turned into quite a handy utility man on the rugby field, and sort of watching that is quite joyful.
probably best to avoid 23 and me, you know. Beatles or Stones?
Jones, dead simple, straightforward,
Mac or PC?
PC,
Beer or wine
both
in the past?
in the past,
Um,
neither at the moment.
Football or rugby?
Um, Both slightly different reasons. I'm a passionate Newcastle United supporter. If I lived closer to the northeast, I'd go every Saturday, but don't. So like that. I also love watching rugby league as well. I mean, it's such great fun. Probably league more than union,
I was going
but
to say, so the combination of Newcastle United and rugby league means that you would be basically quite common, you know. What
very,
that great phrase that used to be used. The late Alan Clark used to describe it as slightly below the salt.
as I said, I'm a coal miner's son, so it's fine.
Yeah, the my good friend, professor of surgery in Sheffield, who shall remain nameless, uh, was applying for medical school in Barts, and he had no medical connections whatsoever. So they started by asking him, "What was your father in Barts?" And he said, "No." He said, "Well, who? Obviously, I mean, who in the family was in Barts?" And they said, "Nobody." And they said, "So what does your father do?" And they said, he said, he's a painter. And they said, "Oh, really? What sort of style is it? Portraits or landscapes?" And to which he said, "Battleships." And he said, as he was on the train back to Newcastle, he was fairly sure the letter of rejection was with him on the on the same train. So, if you had one piece of advice for the 25-year-old Neil Smart, what would it be?
Um, you're going to have a great time in your career. It is going to be an absolute blast. And you know what? Surgery has been enormous fun. It's been great as a career, as a clinician, as an academic, as a medical editor. I've realized that I've been incredibly privileged to work with some of the brightest and the best at every stage of my career. I'm just very thankful for what I've had.
Yeah, it
It's
does.
been great.
I think uh, Jim Harbour is the coach of the Chargers, and he has this thing that he developed in Michigan where he says to the team, "Who has it better than us?" And nobody. So there's no better job than being a surgeon for sure. Yeah.
It's just brilliant. I mean, I've really enjoyed it. And I know there's a lot of negativity about the profession, not just in the UK, globally. You tend to see it from some of the residents in the US too. But I say to people, particularly when you become the boss, patients make your job.
Yeah.
They are an absolute delight to look after by and large. You just have a great time with them.
They
It's
make it
wonderful.
all, they certainly make it worthwhile. Well,
Yeah,
thank you so much, Neil, for taking time on a wintry afternoon to talk
it's
to
been a
me. I
pleasure.
really
Thank you.
appreciate it, and thanks for talking about your journey. It's important, as you say, to talk about it.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.